I mean, I would say the Chancellor is doing the bare minimum to fix the finances. Well, it was pretty much as expected. Since the budget last October, the economic outlook has worsened as a result. The government's fiscal headroom has disappeared and then some. So as a result, the Chancellor was forced to announce some cuts. They'd all been trailed in the press beforehand. Cuts to welfare, cuts to departmental expenditure, yet another effort to crack down on tax avoidance. We get one of those every budget or every spring statement. And beyond that, yes, there were some positive impacts of some supply side reforms so that we end up somewhat suspiciously exactly where we started with £9.9 billion worth of headroom against the fiscal target in 2029-2030. Big takeaway for me is just how much our so-called fiscal events have become an exercise in gaming the OBR forecast. Really, everything revolves around not long-term principled policymaking, but rather about what does the OBR forecast will be the case in 5 years' time. Now, look, I like fiscal rules to constrain spending. I like having an independent watchdog to make sure that the government isn't always marking its own homework. But I think to make policy so focused on a target which is 5 years away and which is always moving and which is subject to so many different variables, this just doesn't make sense at all. I think it has some unfortunate short-term consequences, but what I really worry about is the degree to which this blinds us to the longer-term picture. If we're so focused on current budget surplus in 5 years' time and debt falling as a percentage of GDP, both of which are good things, by the way, but if that's all we focus on, it blinds us to the much longer-term issues around economic growth and the unfunded liabilities of the state as the population ages, which really are the big economic story that these kind of events should be talking about. I mean, I would say the Chancellor is doing the bare minimum to fix the finances, and maybe fixing the finances is putting it a little bit too strongly. Look, this so-called fiscal headroom against the fiscal rule 5 years out is still about a third of the size of the fiscal headroom that previous governments, previous chancellors have generally allowed themselves. As I said, the headroom that was there in October had completely disappeared. So cuts have been made to restore it to pretty much exactly where it was last time around. To me, this is the very definition of doing just enough to meet the rules, but not actually dealing with the fundamental underlying issues. And I won't pretend that dealing with those fundamental underlying issues is easy. It isn't. It's very difficult, and that's why governments always dodge it. But sooner or later, we're going to have to get really serious about the growth problem, really serious about the increase in state spending, and work out how we can put those things right. The growth forecasts, as expected, were pretty grim. It was widely suspected that the OBR was going to halve its growth forecast for 2025. It did, so that dropped from 2% to 1%. And for the rest of the forecast window, the growth figures are pretty lacklustre as well. We're still bobbling along between 1.5 and 2%. Well, actually, not reaching 2%. So, and if you look at the per capita figures, they really are even worse. 2024 and 2025 will basically be two entirely lost years in terms of economic growth per capita. That's terrible. And I think all of this, by the way, even the uptick in growth that we're suspecting or expecting in later years, that really still depends on productivity bouncing back, something the OBR has been forecasting ever since the financial crisis and which has continued not to happen. In my view, after all these years with productivity growth remaining so low, we can't just expect it to bounce back naturally. It's going to take some pretty serious concerted policy reform to get that going again. And then that, of course, feeds through into the growth figures and the fiscal forecasts and everything else. It does feel to me like we're still crossing our fingers and hoping for the best on productivity rather than doing the things that we need to do to turn that around. I think the Chancellor is saying so many of the right things about pro-growth policy, talking about deregulating across government, talking about planning reform, talking about infrastructure. But the problem, I think, is in the detail and in the sort of scope and the vision behind that. The rhetoric's there, but is the substance? I'm not sure. It's hard to pack all this stuff into a spring statement, which after all is just meant to be an update on the economic forecasts and the government's fiscal position. But actually what we're going to need to see from the government over the next months and years is a much more radical, much more thoroughgoing approach to supply-side liberalisation. Look, in this fiscal statement, they got a 0.2% of GDP uplift from planning reform. And the Chancellor was very keen to say, this is cost-free, no fiscal cost whatsoever, only upside. Well, that's easy. It makes it sound easy, and indeed it is easy. If we can do that with a little bit of planning reform, why don't we do it with a lot more planning reform, and then financial regulation reform, and energy regulation reform, and everything else? We really need that robust pro-growth agenda if we're going to make any kind of progress at all.